In the heart of St. Helena Hospital, a young girl is brought in one night unconscious, battered, and abandoned. Her small body bears the silent evidence of unspeakable harm: bruises old and new, fractures left to heal improperly, and scars that tell a story no child should ever endure. Her name is unknown, her past is a mystery, and no one seems to be looking for her. Dr. Elijah Carter, a dedicated physician with a quiet strength, refuses to turn away. Where others see another case, Elijah sees a child crying out for help without words. But as he begins to dig deeper, he finds himself stepping into the shadows of something much darker than he imagined, a web of abuse, cover-ups, and powerful figures determined to keep the truth buried. Mysterious warnings appear. Don't get involved. Anonymous threats follow. The deeper Elijah searches for answers, the more dangerous the consequences become, not just for him, but for the little girl whose trust he has earned. And when he's falsely accused of harming the very child he's trying to save, Elijah must face not only the corruption around him, but the prejudices that have haunted him his entire life. What happens when doing the right thing comes at the highest cost? Can one man's determination to protect the innocent shine a light on a darkness no one wants to see? The steady hum of fluorescent lights filled the emergency room at St. Helena Hospital. It was a sound Dr. Elijah Carter had grown used to during his years working the night shift. The familiar rhythm of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps created a strange comfort amidst the chaos. Patients came and went, each with their own story: a broken arm, chest pains, or feverish children. Elijah had seen it all, but tonight felt different. Elijah paused at the nurse's station, glancing up at the old clock on the wall. Midnight. The thick smell of antiseptic in the air clung to him like a second skin as he rubbed his tired eyes. His day had started hours ago, and exhaustion clawed at him, but there were still more patients to see. "Dr. Carter, we have a critical incoming," Nurse Jennifer called from across the room, her voice tight with urgency. "Ambulance ETA, 2 minutes." Elijah straightened his posture and reached for his stethoscope. Details? Unidentified minor. No ID, unconscious, severe injuries. Possible abuse. Jennifer's tone wavered on the last word, her face pale. Even seasoned nurses had trouble with these cases. Elijah's chest tightened as he followed Jennifer down the hallway. Abuse cases were always the hardest. He had learned to stay focused on the treatment, but deep inside, they haunted him. It was not just the physical wounds, but the invisible scars, the ones no medical instrument could measure. The ambulance screeched to a stop outside the emergency entrance. The double doors burst open, and 2 EMTs rushed a small body on a gurney into the ER. The child's face was hidden behind an oxygen mask, her body covered in blankets except for a fragile arm hanging limply over the side. "What do we have?" Elijah asked briskly, falling into step with the EMTs. "Female, approximately 7 years old, found unconscious in a public park, severe bruising on her abdomen and back, broken wrist, signs of older injuries. Vitals are weak, no identification on her, and nobody at the scene claimed her," one of the EMTs reported, his voice clipped and professional. Elijah's eyes flickered to the small, motionless girl. Her dark hair was matted, her skin pale. The bruises on her visible arms stood out, deep purples and yellows, ugly reminders of violence. A sharp pang shot through Elijah, but he shook it off. She needed him to stay focused. "Let's move her to Trauma 1, Elijah ordered. "Jennifer, prep for fluids and blood work. Get an X-ray team ready. We need a full body scan." The team moved with precision, transferring the child onto the sterile bed. Machines beeped as wires connected to her small frame. Elijah's mind sharpened as he examined her injuries. A grim confirmation of what he had suspected: this was no accident. The bruises, the fractures, even the faint scars around her ankles, they all told a silent story of suffering. Who could do this to a child? The thought burned in his mind as he adjusted her IV line. "Doctor, her BP is dropping," a nurse called, anxiety lacing her voice. "Push fluids," Elijah said firmly. "We need to stabilize her." For the next hour, the team worked in tense silence, focused on saving her life. Elijah's hands moved methodically, years of experience guiding him. Despite the chaos, he felt an odd calmness. It was the same feeling he always got when he was doing what he did best: healing. Finally, the machine steadied, the frantic beeping slowing into a rhythmic hum. The girl's vitals had stabilized, but she remained unconscious. Elijah let out a slow breath, pulling his gloves off as he stepped back from the bed. "She's stable for now," he said to the team. "Good work, everyone." Jennifer placed a blanket over the child, tucking it gently around her small body. "Poor kid," she whispered. "Who would leave her like that?" Elijah did not answer. He stood at the edge of the bed, studying the girl's peaceful face. Despite the bruises and swelling, there was something delicate about her, something innocent, that made his chest ache. "Jennifer, make sure the social worker gets here as soon as possible," he said quietly. "Yes, doctor," Jennifer replied, giving him a small nod before leaving the room. The hum of the machines was the only sound now. Elijah stepped closer to the bed, looking down at the girl. "Who are you?" he wondered. "Where did you come from?" Her silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing on him. "Do not get involved." The voice startled him. Elijah spun around to find the source, his eyes landing on the patient in the next bed over. An elderly man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes stared back at him. He lay still, his frail hands folded on his chest. "Excuse me?" Elijah said, frowning. The man's gaze was sharp and clear, despite his sickly appearance. "Do not get involved," he repeated, his voice gravelly and cold. "It is not safe." Elijah's stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" But the man said nothing more. He closed his eyes as though he had not spoken at all. The silence in the room grew louder. Elijah turned back to the girl, unsettled. He looked down at her tiny hand resting on the sheets, bruises encircling her wrist like a dark bracelet. The man's words rattled in his mind. "Do not get involved." Elijah left the trauma room a short while later, his thoughts heavy. He checked in with other patients, throwing himself back into his routine, but his mind kept drifting to the girl. He had seen abuse cases before, but something about this one gnawed at him. Around 3 a.m., Elijah slipped into the staff lounge for a moment of quiet. The small room was dimly lit, with old coffee stains on the counter and a beat-up microwave humming faintly. Elijah poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee and sank into a chair. He stared at the dark liquid in his cup, his thoughts spiraling. Why had the old man said that? "Do not get involved." It was as if he knew something Elijah was not supposed to. A soft knock pulled him from his thoughts. Nurse Jennifer stood in the doorway, holding a folder. "Social worker's on her way," she said. "Also, the police came by earlier, but they seemed pretty dismissive of the whole thing." "Dismissive?" Elijah asked sharply. Jennifer hesitated. "Yeah?" "Said they'll file a report, but did not seem too interested. Just another abandoned kid, I guess." Elijah set his coffee down, his jaw tightening. Another abandoned kid. The words made him angry. How could anyone look at that girl and shrug it off? "Thanks, Jennifer," Elijah said quietly. "Let me know if anything changes." As Jennifer left, Elijah leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. It was not just exhaustion weighing on him now. It was the girl, the bruises, the silence, the eerie warning from the old man. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Elijah stood by the girl's bedside once more. Her chest rose and fell steadily, her small frame swallowed by the hospital bed. In the daylight, the bruises looked even worse. "Who did this to you?" Elijah murmured, more to himself than her. He felt a flicker of helplessness. The police did not care. The social worker would file her case into a growing pile, and the system would fail her like it failed so many others. He had seen it before. But something about this case, it would not let him walk away. Do not get involved. The warning echoed again, like a shadow creeping over his mind. Elijah shook his head. He could not ignore her, not this time. He thought of his mother, who had taught him to always fight for what was right, no matter how hard it was. He thought of the old wounds in his own life, moments when someone's kindness had saved him. "I will figure this out," he said softly, his voice steady. "I promise." As the sun rose higher, flooding the room with light, Elijah knew that this was just the beginning. Something dark surrounded this girl, something that would test everything he believed in. But he would not turn away. The hospital was quieter in the early hours of the morning, but Elijah's mind was anything but. He stood by the girl's bedside, studying her bruised face in the pale light streaming through the window. Her breathing was steady, but she hadn't stirred. She remained locked in a silent world that Elijah desperately wished he could understand. "Good morning, doctor," Nurse Jennifer said softly as she entered the room, holding a clipboard. "The social worker's on her way. Should be here by 8. Elijah nodded, his gaze still on the girl. "Any updates overnight?" "Stable vitals, but no change otherwise." Jennifer hesitated before speaking again. "This case, it feels off, doesn't it?" Elijah glanced at her, noting the worry in her expression. "How so?" Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. It's not just the injuries. It's like no one's looking for her. Not a parent, a guardian, no one. And those bruises—" She trailed off, her voice tight with emotion. Elijah knew what she meant. The bruises told a story no child should have to carry. They were deliberate, not accidental. Someone had hurt her repeatedly and then left her to die. "We'll figure this out," Elijah said, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring, Jennifer or himself. Hours later, the social worker arrived. Marissa Reed was a petite woman in her mid-30s, with short auburn hair and tired eyes that hinted at the weight of her job. She carried a black bag over her shoulder and wore a smile that, while warm, couldn't quite mask her exhaustion. "Morning, Dr. Carter," she said, shaking his hand. "Sorry it took so long to get here. I was across town handling another case." "No problem," Elijah replied. "Thank you for coming." Marissa turned to the girl in the bed. "This must be her." "Yes. No identification, no missing person reports matching her description yet." Elijah paused, his voice quieter now. "And her injuries, there's no question. She's been abused." Marissa's jaw tightened, and she moved closer to the bed, studying the small figure. "How bad?" Elijah handed her the chart. Multiple bruises, some fresh, others healing. A fractured wrist, likely from being grabbed or restrained. Older scars on her legs and back. She's been hurt for a long time. Marissa closed her eyes for a moment, as though steeling herself against the harsh reality of the situation. "And no one saw anything?" "She was found unconscious in a public park. No witnesses. Whoever left her made sure she wasn't seen." "Jesus." Marissa let out a slow breath, flipping through the chart. "I'll start working on her case, see what I can dig up. If there's family out there or anyone looking for her, I'll find them." Elijah folded his arms, looking down at the girl. "If they cared about her, she wouldn't be here." Marissa met his eyes. "You're probably right, but we can't assume. The system isn't perfect, doctor. It fails a lot of kids. Sometimes the people who are supposed to care the most are the ones who do the most damage." Elijah nodded, but her words only deepened his unease. The system isn't perfect. He had heard that before too many times. It never made him feel better. "Let me know if you need anything," he said. "I will." Marissa gave him a small, tired smile. "And, doctor, thank you for caring." Elijah said nothing as she left the room, her bag slung over her shoulder, like a burden she couldn't set down. He stayed by the girl's bed a moment longer, his heart heavy. That afternoon, Elijah found himself in the small, sterile office of Mr. Langston, the hospital administrator. The man sat behind his desk, a towering stack of files arranged in precise rows. He was bald, in his mid-50s, with a face that rarely smiled. "Dr. Carter," Langston began, his voice cool and professional, "please have a seat." Elijah lowered himself into the chair across from Langston, his gut already telling him this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. "I wanted to speak to you about the case you're handling," Langston said. "The unidentified girl." Elijah frowned. "What about her?" Langston adjusted his tie, looking uncomfortable. "I've received some calls from concerned individuals. They're suggesting it would be best if we leave this matter to the proper authorities." Elijah's brow furrowed. "What individuals?" Langston avoided his gaze. "Just concerned parties. People who feel that prying too deeply into this case might cause unnecessary trouble for the hospital and for you." Elijah's heart began to pound. "Unnecessary trouble?" He straightened in his chair. "With all due respect, sir, this child is my patient. It's my job to care for her and ensure her safety. If she's been abused, we need to find out who's responsible." Langston's lips thinned. "And I'm not saying otherwise. But we don't want to step on any toes, do we? Cases like this can be complicated." Elijah stared at him, disbelief simmering beneath the surface. "Are you suggesting we ignore the signs of abuse?" Langston's eyes flashed with irritation. "I'm suggesting that you focus on your job as a doctor. Leave the investigation to others. That's all." Elijah's jaw clenched. The conversation felt like a warning, just like the old man's words the night before. "Don't get involved." But how could he not? "I'm not going to ignore this, Mr. Langston," Elijah said evenly. "That girl deserves justice." Langston sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're a good doctor, Dr. Carter. Don't let this distract you from your work." Elijah stood, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Thank you for your concern, but I know where my priorities lie." Without another word, he turned and left the office, his pulse racing. Outside in the hallway, he paused to take a deep breath. His instincts screamed that something bigger was at play here, something no one wanted him to uncover. "Do not get involved." The words echoed again, but Elijah shook them off. Later that evening, Elijah sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched bowl of soup in front of him. His small apartment was modest, but tidy, a reflection of his life. The beige walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph of his mother, smiling warmly on the day he graduated from medical school. She had been his rock, his reason for pushing forward, when life got hard. Her voice still echoed in his mind sometimes. "Always fight for what's right, Eli, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." The exhaustion from the long shift had settled deep into his bones, but Elijah couldn't stop thinking about the girl. He couldn't stop thinking about how easily people were willing to look away. The next morning, as Elijah walked back into the hospital, he noticed something strange. A man in a dark suit stood near the entrance, his hands in his pockets. He was tall, with slicked back hair and sunglasses that hid his eyes. Elijah paused, watching the man for a moment. The stranger appeared to be looking for someone, scanning the people who walked past him. But when Elijah approached, the man turned abruptly and disappeared into the crowd. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, Elijah entered the hospital and made his way to the girl's room. As he stepped inside, he was startled to see her eyes wide and dark, staring at him for the first time. "You're awake," he said softly, his voice calm as he approached the bed. The girl flinched slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She said nothing, her gaze darting around the room like a frightened animal. Elijah lowered himself into the chair beside her bed. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe here. My name is Elijah. I'm your doctor." The girl stared at him for a long moment before looking away, her small shoulders trembling. Elijah's heart ached. Whoever had done this to her had stolen more than her safety, they had stolen her voice. "It's okay," he repeated softly. "You don't have to say anything. I'll be right here." He stayed by her side, the silence heavy between them. Outside the window, the world moved on, but inside the small hospital room, time seemed to stand still. The little girl's wide eyes haunted Elijah as he moved through his rounds that morning. Though she had not spoken, the terror etched into her small face lingered with him like a shadow. It was the kind of fear that came from experience of being hurt, of being betrayed, of not knowing who to trust. He had seen that look before, mostly in patients who had lived through unspeakable trauma. But in a child, it was something else entirely. It was a silent scream that no one could hear. At noon, Elijah met Marissa in the hospital cafeteria. She had papers spread across the table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. Her hair was pulled back, and her face looked even more drawn than it had yesterday. "I thought you were supposed to eat during lunch," Elijah said, pulling out a chair across from her. Marissa looked up and gave a tired smile. "Maybe tomorrow. I've been following up on your girl." Elijah's eyebrows rose. "Anything?" Marissa pushed her coffee aside and sighed. "I've got a name, Eve. That's what the police had in their initial report. But here's the weird part." She lowered her voice, glancing around the cafeteria as though someone might be listening. "The report was closed, officially shut down 2 weeks ago. No explanation." Elijah frowned. "Closed? Why?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." She passed a thin folder across the table. "All they gave me was a summary. The police claimed it was a misunderstanding, said Eve's case didn't meet their criteria for further investigation." Elijah opened the folder. Inside were just a few notes. 7-year-old female, found with injuries consistent with a fall. No criminal investigation required. Case closed. The words felt like a slap to the face. A fall? He thought of the bruises on Eve's arms, the marks on her back, the broken wrist that had clearly been twisted and pulled. Anyone who looked closely would know the truth. "They're covering something up," Elijah said, his voice low. Marissa nodded grimly. "I thought the same thing." Elijah ran a hand over his face, frustration simmering just below the surface. "Do you know anything about her family? Anyone who might be looking for her?" "Nothing yet," Marissa said. "Whoever filed the report must have had some sway. The police aren't giving me much." Elijah stared down at the file again. The silence surrounding Eve's case felt intentional, like a door being slammed shut. He thought of Mr. Langston's warning the day before, the man's carefully chosen words. "We don't want to step on any toes." Whose toes? Elijah thought. And what were they hiding? Later that afternoon, Elijah checked on Eve again. She had drifted off to sleep, her small form barely making a dent in the bed. He adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, his movements careful and deliberate. "Dr. Carter?" Nurse Jennifer's voice came from the doorway. Elijah turned to face her. "Yes? There's someone here to see you," Jennifer said. "An officer." Elijah's pulse quickened. Did he say why? "No, but he's waiting in the hallway." Jennifer gave him a questioning look. "You okay?" Elijah nodded, though something felt off. "I'm fine, thanks, Jennifer." He stepped out of the room and saw a man standing near the nurse's station. The officer was tall, with a hard expression and sharp features. His navy uniform was pressed and spotless, his badge gleaming under the overhead lights. "You're Dr. Carter?" the officer asked. His tone clipped. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Officer Brady. I need to ask you a few questions about the girl you're treating." Elijah folded his arms. "What kind of questions?" Officer Brady pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping it open. "When she was brought in, did you notice anything unusual?" Elijah narrowed his eyes. "Unusual how?" The officer looked up, his gaze cold. "Anything about her condition? Anything that stood out?" Elijah hesitated. Why was this man asking questions now? And why did his tone seem less like concern and more like suspicion? She had obvious signs of abuse, Elijah replied firmly. Bruises, fractures, injuries consistent with prolonged harm. That should be enough to open an investigation. Officer Brady's jaw tightened. He scribbled something in his notebook. You're certain about the abuse? I am. Brady's pen froze, hovering above the page. He glanced at Elijah, his expression unreadable. Sometimes, doctor, it's best not to jump to conclusions. Elijah's anger flared. Excuse me? Brady shut his notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. Just be careful, Dr. Carter. That's all I'm saying. Careful of what? Elijah pressed, his voice sharp. The officer stepped closer, his voice dropping low. Some cases are better left alone. There it was again, that same warning. Do not get involved. The words hung heavy between them. Before Elijah could respond, Brady turned and walked away, his polished boots clicking against the tile floor. Elijah stood rooted in place, his mind spinning. This was no coincidence. First the old man's cryptic words, then Mr. Langston's veiled threats, and now this officer. They all pointed to one thing. Someone wanted this case buried. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his apartment, the glow of his desk lamp casting shadows on the walls. The folder Marissa had given him lay open in front of him, Eve's name scribbled in shaky handwriting. He studied the words until they blurred together. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him like a heavy coat. His mind drifted back to his childhood, the years spent in a rough neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and survival was a day-to-day struggle. His mother had worked herself to the bone to keep him in school, to keep him safe. You always fight for what's right, Eli, she used to say, even when it feels like the world is against you. He could hear her voice now, clear as day, and it brought a lump to his throat. His mother had believed in justice, in kindness, in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. He owed it to her to do the same. But this situation was bigger than anything he had faced before. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could ruin him. The weight of it pressed on him, making him question whether he should back away. The next day, Elijah arrived at the hospital early. As he passed the entrance, he caught sight of the man in the dark suit, again the same man he had seen the day before. He was standing near the parking lot, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, watching the hospital with unsettling stillness. Elijah stopped, his heartbeat quickening. For a moment, the man's gaze met his. Then he turned and disappeared into a nearby car, the black sedan pulling away without a sound. The unease in Elijah's stomach deepened. Someone was watching. Someone was paying attention to his every move, and they were warning him again and again not to get involved. As he stepped into the hospital, Elijah decided he would not turn away from Eve. He would not ignore what was happening. No matter who was watching, the day wore on like a storm waiting to break, the weight of the previous days pressing down on Elijah as he checked on patients and made his rounds. Each time he passed the door to Eve's room, he paused, his hand lingering on the handle, as if waiting for some answer to come to him. When he finally stepped inside, Eve was awake. Her dark eyes tracked him warily as he entered, her small frame swallowed by the oversized hospital bed. "Good morning," Elijah said softly, pulling a chair beside her bed. He made sure his movements were calm, giving her space. "I'm Dr. Carter. I'm here to help you." The little girl said nothing, clutching the blanket with both hands. Her face, though no longer bruised and swollen as it had been, was still guarded, her gaze darting toward the door as if expecting someone to come for her. Elijah's chest ached as he took in her fear. "You are safe here," he assured her gently. "No one is going to hurt you." For a moment, he thought she might respond. Her lips parted slightly, but then she looked away, shrinking further into herself. Elijah let the silence linger, understanding she needed time. "I'll come back later," he said softly, standing to leave. As he turned to the door, he heard a faint whisper behind him. Eve. He froze. Slowly, he turned back around, his heart skipping a beat. Did you say something? She glanced up at him, her small voice barely audible. Eve. Her name. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. Is that your name? She gave the faintest nod, her fingers still clinging to the blanket. Elijah crouched beside her, keeping his voice soft and steady. Eve, that is a beautiful name. Do you know your last name? Eve shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Her tiny shoulders trembled, and Elijah knew he had pushed enough for now. It's okay, he whispered. That's all I need to know for now. Thank you, Eve. She looked at him for a long moment before whispering, Are you going to send me back? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Elijah swallowed hard, choosing his next words carefully. I will make sure you are safe, Eve. No one will hurt you again. I promise. A tear slipped down her cheek, and Elijah had to force himself to stay calm. He knew that promise would be hard to keep harder than she could understand. Outside the room, Elijah found Marissa standing near the nurse's station. She looked up from her phone, her expression tense. You look like you've seen a ghost. She spoke, Elijah said, his voice hushed. Her name is Eve. Marissa's eyes widened. You're sure? She said it herself, Elijah replied. It's a start, isn't it? Marissa tucked her phone into her pocket and nodded. Yes, it's something. I'll take that back to the police and child services. Maybe it will shake something loose. Elijah hesitated. Marissa, the officer who came yesterday, Brady, he was acting strange. It was like he wanted me to drop this, like he was here to intimidate me. Marissa's expression darkened. Brady, I've dealt with him before. He has friends in high places. Whenever there's a case involving the more powerful families around here, he tends to look the other way. That's what I'm afraid of, Elijah said. Someone's trying to bury this case. Marissa leaned in, her voice low. If there's something bigger going on here, we'll need evidence. Real evidence. Are you sure you want to keep digging, Elijah? Elijah looked back toward Eve's room, his resolve hardening. I can't stop now. Not when that little girl is depending on us. Marissa studied him for a moment before nodding. Then we dig. That evening, Elijah left the hospital late, his steps heavy with exhaustion. The sun had long since set, and the parking lot was nearly empty. He rubbed a hand over his face as he approached his car, the events of the day replaying in his mind. Then he felt it, a presence. He stopped, his keys halfway to unlocking his door. The lot was quiet, but he knew he was being watched. Slowly, he turned his head and saw the figure again, the same man in the dark suit, standing near the far end of the lot. The man didn't move. He stood there, silent and still, the shadow of the streetlight stretching long across the pavement. Elijah's pulse quickened. Hey, he called, his voice sharp in the night air. Who are you? The man said nothing. Instead, he turned and disappeared around the corner of the hospital building. Elijah hesitated for a split second before his instincts took over. He broke into a jog, following the man around the corner and into the alleyway behind the hospital. But the man was gone. The alley was empty, the faint hum of streetlights the only sound. Elijah looked around, his breath coming fast. Whoever this man was, he was trying to send a message, and Elijah had no doubt it was tied to Eve. Shaking his head, Elijah returned to his car and climbed in. He locked the doors and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. You're in something deep, he muttered to himself. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Marissa's name flashed across the screen. He answered quickly. Marissa, what is it? Her voice was breathless, laced with urgency. Elijah, I found something. About Eve. What is it? Marissa paused. There's a missing person report, one that matches her description exactly, but it's sealed. The family who filed it? They're connected to a state senator. Elijah, this is bad. Really bad. Elijah's stomach dropped. A senator? Yes, someone powerful. Marissa hesitated before adding, "It explains why the police are staying quiet, why people like Officer Brady are trying to intimidate you. This family doesn't want anyone digging into Eve's case, and if they find out you're still asking questions." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "What happens to Eve?" Marissa's voice softened. "She'll disappear into the system, or worse, go back to the people who did this to her." Elijah closed his eyes, dread washing over him. This was bigger than he had imagined. A child's life was hanging in the balance, and the people responsible had the power to make her suffering disappear as if it never happened. "I won't let that happen," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Elijah, you need to be careful. You've already been warned." "I don't care," Elijah replied. "They can threaten me all they want, but I'm not letting that little girl down." There was silence on the line. Then Marissa said, "I'll keep digging. Be safe." "You too." As Elijah hung up, he sat in the dark car, his heart pounding. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, but there was no turning back now. If Eve's abusers were connected to a powerful family, if they had people like Brady and Langston in their pockets, then Elijah would have to tread carefully. But he had made a promise. Eve's small, frightened face flashed in his mind, and his mother's words echoed once more. "You always fight for what's right, Eli, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, his mind racing. Somewhere out there, powerful people were watching him, waiting for him to stop. But Elijah knew one thing for certain. He would not stop, not until Eve was safe. Elijah couldn't sleep. The events of the past few days replayed in his mind like a broken record. Eve's bruises, her whispered name, Officer Brady's cryptic warning, and the man in the dark suit who seemed to be everywhere but nowhere all at once. The pieces of the puzzle were piling up, but none of them fit together yet. The clock on his nightstand read 3:15 a.m. Moonlight slanted through his bedroom window, illuminating the small, sparsely furnished space. A bookshelf, a lamp, and a stack of medical journals sat in neat piles. On the wall hung only one photograph, his mother's smiling face from the day he graduated medical school. Her warmth seemed distant tonight. He rubbed his eyes, then glanced at his phone. He had been waiting for a message from Marissa, hoping she'd find more on Eve's case, but there was nothing. By morning, Elijah had pushed through his exhaustion, determined to face another day at the hospital. On the drive there, the radio hummed softly, but Elijah's mind was miles away. As he pulled into the parking lot, he scanned for anything unusual. No sign of the man in the suit today. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. At the nurse's station, Jennifer flagged him down. "Dr. Carter," she said, lowering her voice, "Mr. Langston wants to see you." Elijah frowned. "Again?" Jennifer nodded, her expression uneasy. He seemed annoyed. Elijah didn't need a crystal ball to know what Langston wanted. His persistence in Eve's case was ruffling feathers. Still, he straightened his shoulders and made his way to Langston's office. The administrator looked up as Elijah entered, his face pulled into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dr. Carter," Langston said, gesturing to the chair, "please sit." Elijah remained standing. "What can I do for you, Mr. Langston?" Langston's fake smile disappeared. "I understand you're still pursuing questions about the unidentified child." "I am," Elijah said evenly. "Her name is Eve." Langston's jaw tightened. "Regardless of her name, I need you to remember that you're a doctor, not an investigator. This hospital cannot afford unnecessary attention, especially when it comes to sensitive cases like this." "What kind of attention are you talking about?" Elijah asked, crossing his arms. Langston stood, walking to the window. His voice dropped to a quieter tone. There are powerful people involved here, Dr. Carter. People who can make life very difficult for those who overstep. My advice to you, stay focused on your work. So, you're telling me to look the other way? Elijah's voice was calm, but his anger simmered beneath the surface. Langston turned to face him, his expression cold. I'm telling you to protect your career. Men like you don't always get second chances. The words hit Elijah like a slap, their meaning clear. He knew what Langston meant, what he was implying. He had spent his entire career proving himself, walking the tightrope of being a black doctor in a predominantly white hospital. He had worked twice as hard to be taken seriously, and yet here he was, again being reminded of his place. Elijah's fingers curled into fists at his sides. With all due respect, Mr. Langston, I didn't become a doctor to ignore abuse. I didn't take an oath to look the other way. Langston's face darkened. Be careful, Dr. Carter. Some battles are not worth fighting. Elijah turned and walked out of the office without another word. His heart pounded in his chest as he replayed Langston's threat in his mind. Some battles are not worth fighting, but this wasn't just a battle. It was a child's life. When Elijah returned to Eve's room, he found her curled up under the blanket, staring at the window. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was something strong in the way she refused to cry. Good morning, Eve, Elijah said softly, sitting in the chair beside her bed. How are you feeling today? Eve turned her head slightly to look at him. She didn't speak, but she didn't shrink away either. It felt like progress. I brought you something, Elijah said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, stuffed teddy bear, soft and worn, with one ear slightly drooping. I thought you might need a friend. Eve's eyes widened, and for the first time, her lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. She reached out with trembling fingers and took the bear, holding it close to her chest. I had one just like this when I was a kid, Elijah said. It belonged to my sister, but she let me borrow it whenever I was scared. Eve's gaze flickered to him, her dark eyes questioning. Elijah smiled faintly. I was scared a lot growing up. Things weren't always easy for me, but my mom used to tell me that being afraid is okay. It just means you're still fighting. Eve clutched the bear tighter, her small fingers curling into the fabric. Still fighting, she whispered. Elijah froze, his chest tightening. It was the first time he had heard her speak more than a word. Her voice was faint, like a breeze barely stirring the air, but it carried so much weight. Yes, Elijah said softly, his throat thick. Still fighting. Later that day, Marissa called Elijah into her office. She looked pale, her desk littered with open files and half-empty coffee cups. I have news, she said as he sat down, and it's not good. Elijah leaned forward, bracing himself. Tell me, Marissa slid a document across the desk. The missing person report, the one tied to Eve? It was filed by the Whitmore family. Elijah's breath caught. As in Senator Whitmore? Marissa nodded grimly. His family. I dug deeper, and the police report was sealed almost immediately after it was filed. That doesn't happen unless someone with serious influence pulls strings. Elijah stared at the file, his mind racing. The Whitmores were one of the most prominent families in the state. Senator Whitmore was powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. If they were involved in Eve's abuse, if they were the ones trying to bury the truth, then Elijah was up against far more than he realized. Marissa, we need more proof, Elijah said quietly. We can't accuse someone like Whitmore without solid evidence. Marissa nodded. I know. I've already started reaching out to people who used to work for the Whitmores. Housekeepers, nannies, anyone who might know something. But we need to be careful, Elijah. These people don't play fair. I don't care how powerful they are, Elijah said firmly. Eve deserves justice. Marissa sighed, a mixture of exhaustion and admiration in her expression. You're a good man, Elijah, But good men don't always win. Elijah looked her in the eye. Maybe not, but I'll keep fighting anyway. That night, as Elijah left the hospital, the sense of being watched returned. He glanced over his shoulder and caught a glimpse of a black sedan parked near the exit. Its headlights flashed on for a second, then off again, like a warning. Elijah's pulse quickened, but he kept walking, refusing to let fear control him. As he climbed into his car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly. He thought of Eve, clutching the teddy bear with her tiny hands. He thought of Langston's threats and the man in the dark suit. He thought of the Whitmores, untouchable, powerful, dangerous. And then he thought of his mother. Even when it's hard, Eli. Especially when it's hard. The road ahead would not be easy. It would be filled with obstacles, threats, and people who wanted him to fail. But Elijah couldn't stop now. He had made a promise to Eve, a promise he intended to keep. As he drove home through the dark streets, one thought burned in his mind. The truth is worth fighting for. The air in the hospital the next morning felt heavier than usual, like a storm had rolled in and settled over everything. Elijah could sense it, whispers in the halls, lingering glances from the staff. Something was different. Elijah brushed it off as stress, exhaustion from the week that had unfolded. Eve's case was weighing on him, but he wouldn't stop, not now. Not when he had a name and a lead. He checked on Eve before starting his rounds. She was still asleep, the stuffed bear he had given her tucked under her chin. For the first time, she looked peaceful. Seeing her like that, Elijah felt a renewed determination. I'll protect you, Eve, no matter what. An hour later, while Elijah was charting notes in the break room, 2 security guards stepped into the doorway. Their presence immediately caught his attention. Security rarely had reason to interrupt the medical staff. "Dr. Carter," one of them said formally, "you need to come with us." Elijah frowned, setting his pen down. "What is this about?" The guards exchanged a glance, their faces impassive. "We were told to escort you to Mr. Langston's office. He has some concerns that need to be addressed." Elijah's stomach dropped, but he kept his composure. "Concerns about what?" "Sir, you'll need to come with us now." Every nerve in Elijah's body screamed that something was wrong. He stood slowly, his mind already spinning. What now? He thought of Langston's veiled threats, Officer Brady's cryptic words, and the man in the black suit. The pieces suddenly felt like they were locking together, and none of it spelled good news. Mr. Langston's office felt smaller than usual, the air stale and suffocating. Langston sat behind his desk, his hands folded neatly, his expression stone-cold. Beside him stood Officer Brady, his face a blank mask. Elijah's pulse quickened at the sight of the officer, the memory of his last warning echoing in his mind. "Dr. Carter," Langston began, his tone sharper than before, "we have a very serious issue." "What issue?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but firm. Langston pushed a folder across the desk. "These allegations came to our attention early this morning." Elijah picked up the folder, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped it open. Inside were photographs, close-up shots of Eve's injuries, bruises on her arms, her broken wrist. Alongside the photographs was a written statement. The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. "Dr. Elijah Carter is suspected of inappropriate contact and mishandling of a minor patient. A report has been filed accusing him of causing harm to the child during treatment." Elijah's breath caught. "What the hell is this?" Langston's expression remained cold. "A formal complaint, Dr. Carter." "This is ridiculous," Elijah shot back, his voice rising. "You know I didn't harm her. These accusations are completely false." "Nonetheless," Langston replied, his tone icy, "we are required to take these allegations seriously. Effective immediately, you are suspended, pending an investigation." Suspended. The word echoed in Elijah's mind like a gunshot. "You cannot be serious," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "This is a setup. You know this is a setup." Langston leaned back in his chair, unbothered by Elijah's outrage. "The board will decide what happens next. In the meantime, you are not to come near the hospital or contact the patient. Any violation will result in further action." Elijah turned to Officer Brady, who stood silently in the corner of the room. "This is you, isn't it?" he demanded. "You warned me to back off, and when I didn't, you pulled this stunt." Brady's expression remained blank, but there was something smug in the way he held himself. "Be careful with your accusations, Doctor. False claims won't help your case." Elijah slammed the folder shut and shoved it back across the desk. "This is a lie. You know it, and I know it. Whoever is behind this is trying to bury the truth." Langston met his glare. "Leave the premises now, Dr. Carter." Elijah's hands shook as he stepped out into the hallway, his mind a blur of anger and disbelief. Staff turned to stare as he walked past, whispers following him like a ripple in water. He stopped briefly at the nurse's station, where Jennifer stood wide-eyed, clearly aware of what had happened. "Dr. Carter, is it true? Did they—" "It's not true," Elijah said sharply, though he softened when he saw the worry in her face. "I would never harm that little girl." Jennifer nodded quickly. "I know, we all know that. But they're saying whatever they need to," Elijah cut in. "But this isn't over." He turned and strode toward the exit, his heart pounding with anger and frustration. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap, but it did little to clear the storm in his mind. Someone had orchestrated this, someone with enough power to frame him and turn his own hospital against him. Elijah spent the rest of the day pacing in his small apartment, the suspension letter crumpled on the kitchen table. Anger gnawed at him like a fire, but beneath it lay something worse. Helplessness. The people he had trusted, the hospital staff, the administration, had turned their backs on him without question. By evening his phone buzzed. It was Marissa. "Elijah," she said quickly, "I just heard what happened. Are you okay?" "No, I'm not okay," Elijah said, the frustration in his voice clear. "They suspended me, Marissa." "They're saying I hurt Eve," Marissa swore under her breath. "It's a setup. Someone's trying to discredit you." "I know, and I'll bet anything it's connected to the Whitmores." Elijah pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to think. "How do we fight this?" Marissa's voice softened. "First, you need to stay calm. They want you rattled, Elijah. That's how people like this win. But listen, I've been digging more into the Whitmore family. There was a nanny who worked for them years ago. She disappeared after a family incident, but I think I can find her." Elijah's heart lifted slightly. "You think she knows something?" "I do," Marissa said firmly. "If she can confirm what happened to Eve, we'll have evidence, real evidence." "Then find her," Elijah said, his voice steady again. "I'll do whatever it takes to help." Marissa hesitated. "Be careful, Elijah. Whoever did this to you won't stop. They've already shown they're willing to ruin you to keep this quiet." Elijah glanced at the suspension letter on the table. Let them try. That night, as Elijah sat in the silence of his apartment, he realized just how alone he felt. The world outside his window carried on as usual, cars passing by, neighbors going about their lives, but his life had been turned upside down. He thought of Eve, still alone in that hospital bed. Did she know what was happening? Did she know he had been taken away? The image of her clutching that stuffed bear flickered in his mind, and something inside him hardened. Elijah had spent his entire life overcoming challenges others had said were impossible. He had fought through poverty, prejudice, and doubt to become the man he was today. And he would fight this too, because it was not just about him. It was about Eve and every other child who had been failed by the system. It was about refusing to back down when powerful people tried to silence the truth. As he sat there in the dim light, he thought again of his mother's words. Even when it's hard, Eli, especially when it's hard. The path ahead would be dark, but Elijah was ready to walk it. He would find the truth, no matter what it cost him, and he would not let Eve's voice be taken away again. The following morning, Elijah woke to a dull ache in his chest, as if the weight of his suspension had settled inside him overnight. His apartment felt colder than usual, the silence oppressive. Normally, by now, he would be deep into his morning rounds, checking on patients, fixing what he could. But instead, he was here alone and sidelined. His phone sat on the counter, silent. No calls from the hospital, no updates on Eve. A knot of worry twisted in his stomach as he thought of her. Without him, who would make sure she was okay? A knock at the door broke the stillness. Elijah's pulse quickened. He wasn't expecting anyone. Rising to his feet, he opened the door cautiously. Standing there was Nurse Jennifer, bundled in a coat against the morning chill. She held a small paper bag in one hand and wore an uncertain smile. "Jennifer," Elijah said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She shrugged, stepping inside when he gestured her in. "I brought you breakfast," she said, holding up the bag. "It's nothing fancy, just a bagel and coffee." Elijah blinked, momentarily thrown by the unexpected kindness. "You didn't have to do that." Jennifer set the bag on the table and met his gaze. "I know I didn't, but I did." He sat down, watching as she unwrapped the bagel and poured coffee into a chipped mug from his kitchen cabinet. She moved with care, as though this small act of normalcy was something sacred. "I heard what happened," she said softly, sitting across from him. "The accusations, the suspension, it's not right." Elijah stared into the steam rising from the coffee, his voice tight. "No one seems to care if it's right or not." "I care," Jennifer said firmly. "And so do others." Elijah looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no pity there, only quiet determination. "What do you mean?" Jennifer leaned forward, her voice low. "Not everyone at the hospital believes what they're saying about you. People know you, Elijah. They know the kind of doctor you are. I've seen you stay late to comfort grieving families. I've seen you treat patients no one else wanted to deal with. Those people aren't going to forget that just because Mr. Langston says you did something you didn't." Elijah's throat tightened. "That doesn't change anything. I'm still out, and Eve's still in danger." Jennifer paused before replying, choosing her words carefully. "I've been checking on her. She asks about you." The admission struck Elijah in the chest like a hammer. "She asked for me?" Jennifer nodded. "She doesn't say much, but yesterday, when I brought her lunch, she whispered, 'Where's Dr. Carter? She trusts you.'" Elijah rubbed a hand over his face, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Don't let her down," his mother's voice echoed. Jennifer reached into her coat pocket and slid something across the table. It was a folded sheet of paper, creased and worn. "What's this?" Elijah asked, picking it up. "Eve's records," Jennifer said quietly. "The ones they won't let you see." Elijah's eyes snapped to hers. "Jennifer, how did you get this?" "Don't ask," she said, with a small, defiant smile. "Let's just say I've been a nurse long enough to know where things are kept." Elijah unfolded the paper and scanned the contents. His stomach turned as he read through the timeline of injuries: broken ribs, fractured wrists, bruising patterns that told a clear story of abuse spanning years. The earliest records went back almost 3 years, and the last name on the admitting form confirmed what Marissa had already found: Whitmore. Elijah looked up at Jennifer, his voice thick. "This proves she's been hurt over and over again." Jennifer nodded. "I thought you might need it." Elijah exhaled slowly, the fire in his chest reigniting. "Thank you." Jennifer offered a small, sad smile. "You don't need to thank me. You do the same for any of us." She stood and grabbed her coat. "I have to get back to the hospital before anyone notices I'm gone. Stay strong, Elijah. You're not alone. As she left, Elijah sat back in his chair, staring at the medical records. For the first time since his suspension, he didn't feel quite so alone. Jennifer's quiet act of kindness gave him more than information. It gave him hope. That afternoon, Marissa called, her voice laced with excitement. "I found the nanny." Elijah sat up straighter, gripping the phone. "What did she say?" "She's scared," Marissa replied. "Terrified, actually. But she agreed to meet with us. Her name is Ana Torres. She worked for the Whitmores for almost 2 years before she quit. She hinted that she knows what happened to Eve." Elijah felt his pulse quicken. "Where do we meet her?" "There's a diner on the edge of town," Marissa said. "It's quiet. She insisted on somewhere public." "I'll be there," Elijah said without hesitation. The diner sat along an empty stretch of road, its neon sign flickering as the sun set. Elijah parked his car and stepped out, pulling his coat tighter against the brisk evening air. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, a waitress behind the counter, an elderly couple in the corner, and a woman sitting in the last booth by the window. Marissa was already there, sitting across from the woman. She looked up as Elijah approached, her expression tense. "Elijah, this is Ana," Marissa said softly. Ana Torres was a woman in her early 40s, her face etched with worry. She kept glancing at the door, her hands wringing a napkin in her lap. "Thank you for meeting us, Ana," Elijah said gently, sitting down. "I know this isn't easy." Ana's dark eyes flicked to him before darting back to the window. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If they find out—" "They won't," Marissa assured her. "You're safe here." Ana swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I worked for the Whitmores for 2 years. I took care of the children, the senator's son and Eve." "You knew Eve?" Elijah pressed. Ana nodded, her hands trembling. "She's not their child. She was brought there. I don't know where she came from, but the senator's wife didn't want her. She called her a burden." Elijah's stomach churned. "And the abuse?" Ana's eyes filled with tears. "I tried to stop it. I swear I did. But the senator, he's a cruel man. When he was angry, he would take it out on her. His wife turned a blind eye. She didn't care." Elijah clenched his fists beneath the table, rage boiling inside him. "Did you tell anyone? The police?" Ana shook her head violently. "You don't understand. He owns the police. When I quit, I tried to report it. But nothing happened. Instead, they came to my house. They told me to keep my mouth shut, or I'd regret it." Marissa leaned in closer. "Ana, we need your help. We want to protect Eve, but we can't do it without your statement." Ana's face crumpled, fear written all over it. "If I talk, they'll come for me, for my family." "I promise you, we'll protect you," Elijah said firmly. "Eve deserves the truth. She deserves justice." Ana looked at him for a long moment, tears spilling down her cheeks. Finally, she nodded. "I'll tell you everything, but please don't let them find me." Marissa squeezed her hand. "You're doing the right thing, Ana." As they left the diner that night, Elijah felt a new sense of purpose. Ana's testimony could blow the case wide open. It was dangerous, there was no denying that, but it was the first real step toward exposing the truth. "We're getting close," Marissa said as they walked toward their cars. "Too close," Elijah replied, glancing over his shoulder. In the distance, under the glow of a flickering streetlight, a black sedan sat parked on the side of the road. Its engine was running. They were being watched. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't let fear take hold. He thought of Eve, alone in her hospital bed, and Jennifer's quiet words. "You're not alone." "We keep going," Elijah said. "No matter what." The drive back from the diner was long and silent. The headlights from Marissa's car trailed behind Elijah's as they weaved through dark, empty streets. Despite the late hour, Elijah's mind raced with everything Ana Torres had said. The weight of her words sat heavy on him. The senator's wife called her a burden. He would take it out on her. They weren't just stories now. They were facts. Ugly, undeniable facts. Eve's small, frightened face flashed in his mind again, and he gripped the steering wheel tighter. Anna's testimony was a breakthrough, but it also made one thing clear. The Whitmores were more dangerous than Elijah had imagined. They didn't just have power. They owned people. The police, hospital administrators, even the system meant to protect children. As Elijah pulled into his apartment complex, the black sedan from earlier was parked across the street. Its engine rumbled softly, the headlights dim. Elijah sat in his car for a moment, watching the shadowy figure in the driver's seat. Fear clawed at his chest, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he stepped out, locked his car, and walked toward his building with deliberate calm. Whoever was watching him wanted to see him afraid. He refused to give them that satisfaction. When he reached his door, Elijah turned his head just slightly. The sedan's headlights flashed once on and off before it pulled away and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing the edges of Anna's written statement. Marissa had called at sunrise to confirm she'd transcribed everything Anna told them. The story was chilling. Eve had been brought to the Whitmores' home when she was just a toddler, her origins a mystery. The senator's cruelty grew over time, culminating in the severe abuse that left her broken and abandoned. Elijah looked at the clock. It was almost 9 a.m. Marissa had gone to meet with the district attorney, hoping the statement would be enough to force the police to reopen Eve's case. The problem, Elijah knew, was that the Whitmores had built a fortress of influence around themselves. They had the money, connections, and reach to bury anything they wanted. Anna's testimony might not be enough. A sharp knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Elijah frowned and stood, peering through the peephole cautiously. It was Dr. Joanne Hughes. Elijah quickly opened the door. "Dr. Hughes, what are you doing here?" Joanne stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, clutching a file folder close to her chest. "Elijah, I need to talk to you. Now." He closed the door behind her. "What's going on?" Joanne turned to face him, her expression troubled. In her 60s, she was one of the most respected doctors at St. Helena, a mentor to many, including Elijah. Her salt-and-pepper hair framed her sharp, discerning eyes. "I heard about your suspension," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. "I also heard the rumors they're spreading about you. It's disgusting, Elijah." Elijah exhaled, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I knew they'd try something, but this is beyond what I expected." Joanne's gaze softened. "It's because you're close to something. People like the Whitmores, they don't fight fair. They'll tear you down any way they can." Elijah nodded. "I know that, but I can't back off now, not when Eve's life is at stake." Joanne stepped closer, lowering her voice. "That's why I'm here." She placed the file folder on the table and slid it toward him. "I've been digging through some of the hospital records, ones that Langston didn't want anyone to see." Elijah hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were scanned copies of patient charts, some of them going back years. Certain pages were marked with yellow sticky notes. As he flipped through, his heart sank. "These injuries," Elijah murmured, scanning the details. "Multiple children, patterns of abuse, all with private doctors listed under confidentiality agreements." Joanne nodded grimly. "The Whitmores. This isn't new for them. Eve isn't the first." Elijah looked up at her, disbelief and anger swirling in his chest. "They've done this before?" "Yes," Joanne said, her voice steady. "But every time, they've gotten away with it. They have police reports sealed, medical records redacted, and accusations buried. But you, Elijah, you've shined a light on something they can't hide this time." Elijah leaned back in his chair, stunned. "How do we use this?" Joanne sat down across from him. You're going to need help, real help. Lawyers? Journalists. People who can't be bought. I know a reporter at the Gazette. Her name's Avery Clark. If anyone can take this public and protect Eve in the process, it's her. Elijah hesitated. Taking the story public was a risk. It would mean stepping into the center of a storm, one he might not survive professionally. But the alternative? Letting the Whitmores win, turning his back on Eve. I'll do it, Elijah said finally, his voice firm. I'll talk to this reporter. Joanne placed a hand on his arm. Be careful, Elijah. You're walking a dangerous line. I know, he said, but someone has to. That afternoon, Elijah sat in a corner booth of a small downtown coffee shop. Across from him sat Avery Clark, a sharp, no-nonsense journalist with a keen eye and a reputation for taking on tough stories. She wore a dark blazer, her laptop open in front of her. Dr. Carter, Avery said, typing as she spoke, let me be clear. If I run this story, it's going to make waves. The Whitmores will come after you. Hard. I'm not worried about me, Elijah said. I'm worried about Eve. She doesn't have anyone else. Avery studied him for a moment before nodding. Tell me everything. From the beginning. For the next hour, Elijah recounted everything. Eve's arrival at the hospital, the signs of abuse, the cryptic warnings from Officer Brady, Ana Torres's testimony, and Joanne's findings in the hospital archives. Avery listened carefully, asking pointed questions as she typed furiously. When he finished, she closed her laptop. This is bigger than I thought, she admitted, but it's exactly the kind of story the public needs to hear. Will you run it? Elijah asked. Yes, Avery said, but I'll need Anna's full cooperation and a few more sources to back this up. I'll also need to reach out to the district attorney. This can't just be a headline. It has to lead to action. Elijah nodded, relief flooding through him. Whatever you need. Avery leaned in, her voice low. You need to lay low for a while. People like the Whitmores, when they feel cornered, they get dangerous. Elijah met her gaze, his resolve unshakable. Let them come. I'm not backing down. That evening, Elijah returned to his apartment, exhaustion dragging at him. As he stepped inside, his phone buzzed with a message from Marissa. DA's office is reviewing Anna's statement. This might be it, Elijah. We're so close. He sank onto the couch, letting the news sink in. They were close, so close to justice for Eve. But as the relief settled over him, there was a sharp knock at the door. Elijah froze. The knock came again, harder this time. His heart thudded in his chest as he rose and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, there was no one there, just an envelope lying on the welcome mat. Frowning, Elijah picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. Scrawled across it in red ink were the words, "Back off. Final warning." Elijah's blood ran cold. He stepped back, glancing down the empty hallway. Whoever had left this note was closer than he wanted to believe. His first instinct was fear. His second was anger. I will not back down. Elijah tore the note in half and tossed it into the trash. He turned toward the small framed photo of his mother hanging on the wall. Her words came back to him, stronger than ever. Even when it's hard, Eli, especially when it's hard. He sat back down and picked up his phone to call Marissa. Elijah sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the torn note in his hands. Back off. Final warning. The letters were jagged, like whoever wrote them was in a hurry or just didn't care. It wasn't the first threat, but this one felt more real. Whoever was behind this was watching him. Close, waiting for him to break. But Elijah wasn't going to break. He couldn't. The steady hum of his phone vibrating pulled him back into focus. Marissa's name flashed across the screen. He answered immediately. Elijah, Marissa said, breathless. The district attorney's office is reopening the case. Elijah sat up straighter. What? When? Effective immediately. Anna's statement gave them just enough leverage to push back against the Whitmore's influence. They've started pulling old files on Eve and reviewing her medical history. This is happening, Elijah. Relief flooded through him like a wave. Finally, Marissa's voice lowered. It's not over yet, though. The DA knows what they're up against, but the Whitmores won't go down quietly. You're going to be a target, Elijah, more than you already are. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. I don't care what they try. I'll keep fighting for Eve. Marissa paused. Good, because there's one more thing you're going to need to testify. The words settled in the air like a stone dropping into water. Testify? Elijah echoed. Yes, Marissa replied. In court, to everything you've seen Eve's injuries, the timeline, and the cover-up you've experienced firsthand. Anna will speak, but they'll need you to reinforce the medical evidence. Elijah's heart skipped. He knew this would come. Going to court, facing the Whitmores, speaking publicly, it was the only way. But it would also mean stepping directly into the line of fire. I'll do it, Elijah said firmly. Marissa exhaled, a mix of relief and concern in her voice. I figured you'd say that. Just be careful, Elijah. We've rattled a hornet's nest. By the time Elijah arrived at the hospital later that afternoon, the atmosphere had changed. Whispers followed him down the hallway, eyes flicking toward him before darting away. Word of the reopened case must have spread, and with it, opinions. A nurse he barely knew stopped him in the hall. Dr. Carter, she said quietly, I just wanted to say, I believe you. Her voice cracked with sincerity, and Elijah paused. The kindness caught him off guard. Thank you, he said, his voice soft. It was such a small gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. Not everyone is against me. Elijah's next stop was Eve's room. Despite the suspension, Jennifer had arranged for him to visit under the radar. The blinds were drawn to dim the room's harsh hospital lights. Eve sat up in bed, the teddy bear he had given her resting in her lap. Hi, Eve, Elijah said softly as he entered. She looked at him, her eyes widening in surprise. You came back. Of course I did, Elijah replied, pulling up the chair beside her bed. I told you I wouldn't leave you. For a moment, Eve studied him, her small fingers clutching the bear. They said you hurt me. The words punched Elijah in the gut, but he kept his expression calm. That's not true, Eve. I would never hurt you. She stared at him for a long moment, as if searching his face for something. Then, quietly, she whispered, I know. Elijah exhaled, relief washing over him. I'm glad you know that. Eve's eyes darted toward the window, her voice dropping lower. Are they coming back for me? No, Elijah said firmly. I won't let them. She looked at him, wide-eyed and small in that big bed, and Elijah felt the weight of his promise pressing down on him. He had to keep it. By evening, Elijah sat in a small conference room across from Avery Clark, the journalist. She had a laptop open, the blue light casting shadows across her face. Marissa sat beside Elijah, flipping through a thick folder of evidence they had pieced together over the past week. Are you sure you're ready for this, Elijah? Avery asked, typing without looking up. Once this story goes live, there's no turning back. I'm ready, Elijah said. People need to know the truth. Avery nodded. We're running everything tomorrow morning, Anna's statement, the hospital records Joanne found, and Eve's injuries. It's enough to blow the cover off their story. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his pulse steady. For the first time in days, he felt the tide turning. The truth was finally clawing its way into the light. Marissa's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Her expression darkened. It's Anna. She's scared again. Avery frowned. She's already given her statement. Marissa nodded. Yes, but someone's been watching her. She said a car's been parked outside her sister's house all afternoon. Elijah's chest tightened. They're trying to scare her into silence. We can't let that happen, Avery said, closing her laptop. If Anna backs out, we lose our strongest witness. I'll talk to her, Elijah said, already reaching for his coat. I'll make sure she knows she's not alone. Ana Torres lived on the outskirts of town in a modest one-story house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Elijah pulled up just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky bruising with deep oranges and purples. Marissa had called ahead, and Anna was waiting. She opened the door cautiously, her eyes darting toward the street. Elijah followed her gaze. A dark sedan sat parked down the block, its engine off, but the faint silhouette of someone inside was visible. Elijah clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay calm. Anna, are you okay? Anna stepped aside, letting him in. I'm scared, she admitted, wringing her hands. What if they hurt my family? They won't, Elijah said firmly. We're going to make sure of that. The DA is already involved, and Avery's publishing the story tomorrow. The world is going to know what they've done. Anna sat down at the small dining table, her shoulders slumped. They have so much power, Dr. Carter. How can we win? Elijah knelt beside her, his voice steady. Because the truth matters. Because people like them rely on silence, and you're brave enough to speak. You're not alone in this, Anna. I promise. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, just barely. Okay. A knock at the door jolted them both. Anna jumped, fear flashing across her face. Stay here, Elijah said softly, rising to his feet. He opened the door cautiously. It was Marissa, her face pale. They know, Elijah, she said, her voice urgent. The Whitmores know about the story. I just got word someone leaked it to them. Elijah's chest tightened. What does that mean? It means they're going to fight back publicly. They'll do everything they can to discredit us. And if that doesn't work, they'll come after you. That night, Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could feel the storm gathering around him. The Whitmores had too much to lose. They wouldn't go down without a fight. And Elijah knew what that meant: more threats, more pressure, more people like Anna being forced into silence. But as he closed his eyes, he thought of Eve's small voice. Are they coming back for me? Not if I can stop them. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He had come too far, and the truth was too important to let go. Elijah knew the fight was only beginning, but he also knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, doing the right thing means walking straight through the fire. The sun was barely up when Elijah's phone buzzed on his nightstand. He grabbed it, his heart already racing. Marissa's name lit the screen. It's live, Marissa said the moment he answered. Her voice was trembling, a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Avery ran the story. The Gazette published everything: Eve's name, Anna's testimony, the Whitmores' history of abuse. It's out there. Elijah swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his mind clearing quickly. What about Anna? Is she okay? She's staying with her sister, Marissa replied. Avery set her up with legal protection. But Elijah, the fallout has already started. It's everywhere. Elijah opened his laptop, his fingers fumbling slightly as he navigated to the Gazette website. The headline stretched across the top of the page in bold letters. State Senator's family tied to child abuse, cover-up, a 7-year-old survivor speaks through silence. Beneath the headline was a photograph of Eve's small, bruised hands clutching the teddy bear Elijah had given her. The caption read, Unidentified child, now safe, becomes the voice of the forgotten. Elijah's breath caught. Seeing it in print felt surreal. After everything, the threats, the warnings, the suspension, Eve's story was finally in the light. For the first time, the truth could no longer be buried. When Elijah arrived at the hospital later that morning, the building was abuzz. Doctors, nurses, and patients were huddled around phones and televisions, murmuring about the headline that had rocked their community. Some glanced at him as he walked through the hallways, some with sympathy, others with curiosity or quiet skepticism. But Elijah didn't care. He had a singular purpose. "Dr. Carter?" Nurse Jennifer appeared at his side, her face a mix of relief and concern. "Mr. Langston wants to see you." Elijah nodded. "Of course he does." Langston's office was exactly as Elijah remembered it, cold, sterile, and intimidating. Langston stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out over the parking lot. He didn't turn when Elijah walked in. "Dr. Carter," Langston said finally, his voice measured, "do you have any idea what you've done?" Elijah stood tall, refusing to back down. "I did what was right." Langston turned slowly, his face pale with thinly veiled anger. "You've put this hospital in the middle of a media firestorm. Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" Elijah met his gaze, unwavering. "The only consequence I care about is protecting Eve. This hospital turned its back on her when she needed us most. You turned your back. Someone had to speak up." Langston's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the door opened. Dr. Joanne Hughes stepped inside, her expression calm but resolute. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice sharp, "the board has requested an emergency meeting. They're reviewing Dr. Carter's suspension." Langston's face stiffened. "This is not the time." "It is the time," Joanne interrupted. "Dr. Carter's actions were about integrity, something this hospital desperately needs right now." Langston looked from her to Elijah, his composure slipping. For the first time, Elijah saw something like defeat in his eyes. "This isn't over," Langston muttered as he turned away. "No," Elijah said quietly. "It's just beginning." Later that afternoon, Elijah sat in Eve's room, the hum of the hospital around them feeling distant and soft. She was awake, sitting up and clutching the teddy bear tightly in her lap. She watched Elijah with quiet curiosity, her dark eyes searching his face. "Is it over?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but steady. Elijah smiled faintly. "Not yet, but soon. The people who hurt you are going to answer for what they did." Eve nodded, as if she understood. Her fingers smoothed the bear's ear absent-mindedly before she looked up at him again. "You didn't leave me." Elijah's throat tightened. "I told you I wouldn't." Eve stared at him for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Thank you." It was just 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything she couldn't say, of all the fear, the loneliness, and the pain. Elijah blinked back the tears that burned at the corners of his eyes. "You're going to be okay, Eve," he said softly. "I promise." By evening, news of the story had spread like wildfire. The Whitmores were trending across every platform, their pristine reputation torn to shreds. The DA announced an official investigation into the family's conduct, citing new evidence of abuse and corruption. Reporters camped outside the Whitmore estate, demanding answers. Marissa called Elijah with the update. "They arrested Officer Brady," she said triumphantly. "Turns out he's been covering for the Whitmores for years, shutting down reports, intimidating witnesses. They're building a case against him now." Elijah allowed himself a small smile. "Good. It's about time." "And Elijah?" Marissa paused. "You're a hero." "I'm not a hero," Elijah replied. "I just did what I had to do." "You didn't have to," Marissa said gently. "You chose to, and because of you, Eve has a chance at a better life." Days later, Elijah sat outside on the bench near the hospital's garden. The winter chill had softened, giving way to a milder, quieter day. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. The fight wasn't over. There would still be court hearings, media coverage, and fallout. But the truth had been set free. Eve was safe, and the people who had hurt her were finally being held accountable. "Mind if I join you?" Elijah looked up to see Nurse Jennifer standing there with 2 cups of coffee. He smiled and gestured for her to sit. "I figured you could use this," she said, handing him one of the cups. Black, no sugar. Thank you, Elijah said, taking a sip. The warmth was soothing, grounding him. Jennifer turned to him, her expression thoughtful. You know, I've been working here a long time. I've seen doctors come and go. But you're different. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Different how? You care, she said simply. And you don't give up, no matter what they throw at you. Elijah stared into his coffee, the steam curling into the cold air. I couldn't give up. Eve deserved better. Someone had to fight for her. Jennifer smiled. And you did. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the faint sounds of the hospital carrying through the air. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, listening to the world move on around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. The following week, Elijah visited Eve one last time before she was transferred to a new foster home. She was stronger now, her face brighter, the bruises fading into faint marks of what had been. As he stepped into her room, she looked up and smiled a real smile, small but genuine. Hi, Dr. Carter." "Hi, Eve," Elijah said, his voice gentle. He sat beside her bed and handed her a small gift bag. "This is for you." Eve pulled out a new teddy bear, this one with soft brown fur and a small red ribbon tied around its neck. "I thought you might need another friend," Elijah said. Eve hugged the bear tightly and looked up at him. "Will I see you again?" Elijah's heart twisted, but he smiled. "You'll be okay now, Eve, and you'll always have people who care about you." She nodded, holding the bear close. "Thank you for saving me." Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. "You saved yourself, Eve. I just helped." As he stood to leave, he looked back one last time. Eve sat in the bed, small but no longer broken. There was hope in her eyes now, a light that hadn't been there before. Elijah stepped into the hallway and let out a slow breath, his mother's words echoing in his heart once more. "Even when it's hard, Eli, especially when it's hard." The weight of silence had been lifted, and in its place was something stronger. Truth, kindness, and the unshakable belief that doing the right thing was always worth the fight. Days turned into weeks, and the world around Elijah slowly began to shift. The Whitmores, once untouchable, now faced the weight of justice. The media frenzy died down, as new headlines replaced the old, but Eve's story remained a quiet, unshakable victory. Elijah stood by the hospital garden one last time, the cool spring air brushing against his face. In the distance, children laughed on the nearby playground, a sound so light and free that it tugged at his chest. He thought of Eve safe now in her foster home, away from the hands that once caused her harm. There would still be battles ahead. The system was flawed, slow to change. But this fight had been won, and sometimes, Elijah realized, that was enough to push the world one step closer to the light. Months later, Elijah received a letter at his office. Inside was a photograph of Eve healthy, smiling, standing on a porch next to her new foster family. Tucked alongside the photo was a note, written in careful block letters. "Dear Dr. Carter, I'm happy now. Thank you for saving me. Love, Eve." Elijah set the letter down, his chest warm with pride and peace. Sometimes the smallest victories were the ones that mattered most. He thought of his mother's words, the ones that guided him through every storm. Even when it's hard, Eli. Especially when it's hard. And this time, he smiled, knowing he'd lived up to that promise. Thank you for joining me on this journey. This story was about fighting for justice, believing in kindness, and standing up for what's right, even when the world tells you to look the other way. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more heartfelt stories that inspire hope and resilience. Your support helps bring stories like this to life, and together we can share messages of empathy, courage, and change. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for being here, and remember, sometimes the smallest voices have the biggest stories to tell.